The planet Earth, now a shadow of its former self, had been at war with the advanced alien race known as the Azerothians for decades. The war had ravaged cities, broken families, and destroyed nearly all of Earth's most advanced technologies. The people who remained lived in small, hidden colonies far away from the enemy's reach, but they never felt truly safe. Every day was a struggle for survival. In the midst of this endless conflict, Captain Bonner, a battle-hardened soldier, had grown used to the quiet. Bonner stood on the high ridge of a small, forgotten colony that was now home to thousands of human refugees. Below him, life seemed to go on normally. Children played in the dirt, their laughter echoing through the air as their parents worked to rebuild the homes lost in previous battles. The Earth itself, though scared, was slowly healing. The people in the colony had created something resembling peace again. It was a peace that had been hard-earned, and yet it was fragile, ready to shatter at the smallest disturbance. Bonner had seen this kind of peace before, just before the storm. For a moment, it seemed like everything was normal. A soft wind blew across the landscape, making the trees rustle gently. Bonner watched as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. It was the kind of peaceful evening that people in other parts of the galaxy would take for granted. But for Bonner and the others here, it was a brief and fleeting calm before what they all knew was coming. The Azerothian fleet had been silent for weeks, but that silence was dangerous. It was a lull, not peace. The Azerothian Eye, a cold, calculating machine intelligence that controlled the alien forces, never rested. Bonner was pulled from his thoughts when an alarm blared, cutting through the tranquility like a knife. He was immediately on his feet, his pulse quickening. His hand instinctively went to the small communicator on his wrist. He hadn't been wrong. The warning lights flashed red, signaling one thing. The Azerothians had found them. "They're here." Bonner's voice was low but steady as he activated his comms to alert the others. He didn't need to say more. The entire colony knew what this meant. The Eye-controlled alien forces were coming. Within moments, the peaceful atmosphere turned to chaos. The once calm streets filled with the hurried steps of refugees scrambling to their shelters. Families gathered their belongings, some in panic, others in grim determination. Children clung to their parents' hands, their faces filled with confusion and fear. The elders, too weak to run, were carefully helped into the underground bunkers where they would be safe, at least for now. The colony's defenses, though strong, were nowhere near enough to stop the full force of the Azerothian fleet. Bonner quickly joined his team of soldiers, including his second-in-command, Sergeant Harper. Harper was younger than Bonner, but just as tough, if not more so. Together, they led the defense efforts, organizing the refugees into smaller, protected groups and giving orders to hold as long as they could. "We're going to need to fight." Bonner's voice was firm as he looked out at the horizon. The sky, once serene, now darkened as Azerothian ships descended from above, their sleek, deadly forms cutting through the atmosphere. The ships were massive, with cloaking devices that made them nearly invisible to the naked eye. Yet Bonner knew them well. The Eye was tactical, brilliant even, and ruthless. The first blast struck the outskirts of the colony, sending a shockwave through the ground. The buildings closest to the impact were vaporized instantly. Orbital bombardment. Bonner's heart sank, but he knew there was no time to waste. The attack had begun, and there was no turning back now. "Move! Now!" Bonner shouted, and the soldiers rushed into action. He could see the flickers of cloaked ships above, just barely visible against the darkening sky. They were here to destroy everything. The humans were vastly outnumbered, their weapons primitive compared to the Azerothian Eye's advanced technology. But Bonner wasn't about to give up without a fight. He had seen the enemy before. He knew they were ruthless, but he also knew that humans were resilient. They fought not only for survival but for each other, and that made them dangerous. As the battle raged, Bonner's mind raced. He gave orders quickly, making sure everyone knew their roles. Harper led a team of soldiers to cover the western perimeter, where the first wave of attackers was coming in. Bonner himself took the north side, where the most vulnerable part of the colony was. But just as Bonner was about to take his position, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the ships, it wasn't the soldiers, it was the children. They were running. No, they were fleeing toward the main shelters, but not all of them would make it in time. A group of children, no older than 10 or 11, were running toward the shelter when a cloaked drone appeared above them, invisible until it was too late. Bonner's instincts kicked in, and he ran toward them, but he knew he couldn't reach them in time. Just then, Sergeant Harper made a split-second decision. Without hesitation, he grabbed a nearby rocket launcher and fired it at the cloaked drone, causing it to drop from the sky. But the explosion was close enough to throw Harper off his feet. Bonner ran to him, pulling him behind cover. Harper was badly injured, but he'd saved the kids. Bonner's heart tightened. This was no ordinary fight. This was a battle for the very soul of humanity. With the enemy closing in, Bonner gathered his remaining strength, ready to lead his people to their last stand. This time, there would be no escape. They would fight, and they would fight to win, no matter the cost. The ground shook violently as the first wave of attacks hit. The peaceful colony, which had been home to thousands of refugees just moments ago, was now a battleground. The sound of explosions echoed in the air, shaking the earth beneath Bonner's feet. The Azerothian fleet had arrived, and their cloaked ships were everywhere. They were impossible to see until they launched their deadly assault. The humans had prepared for this day, but nothing could truly prepare them for the sheer power and precision of the enemy. Bonner's team raced into position, but the battle had already begun. Buildings collapsed under the force of orbital bombardment. The bright, searing light of explosions lit up the sky like a second sun. From the ridge, Bonner could see the entire colony coming under fire. People screamed, running for cover. The children, the elderly, and anyone too weak to defend themselves were the first targets of the enemy drones. These machines, designed by the AI to think, adapt, and destroy, were relentless. They swarmed like locusts, searching for anything that moved. Bonner's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the destruction unfold. He shouted orders to his team, but even his voice seemed to be drowned out by the chaos. The soldiers under his command had trained for this moment their entire lives. They had known that one day they might face the ultimate battle, the day when humanity's survival would depend on every soldier's skill, bravery, and heart. But no amount of training could prepare anyone for this. Bonner quickly scanned the battlefield. He could see Sergeant Harper, wounded but still fighting, directing a group of refugees toward an underground shelter. The people were terrified, but they trusted the soldiers to keep them safe. Bonner knew that this was not just about winning, it was about making sure that the human race would survive. But the odds were against them. The first wave of attackers was led by Azerothian drones, flying low above the ground. They were nearly invisible, but Bonner had learned to spot the faint shimmer of their cloaking devices. He fired his rifle, hitting one of the drones, but the damage was minimal. It wasn't enough. The drones continued to rain hell on the humans below, their weapons tearing through the buildings, turning everything into rubble. Bonner dove for cover as a blast hit nearby, knocking him off his feet. The force of the explosion sent him tumbling across the ground. His ears rang, and his vision blurred for a moment, but he quickly regained his senses. He had no time to waste. The humans had to hold their ground. There was no retreat. "Get up, Bonner. We need you." Harper's voice echoed through the comms. Bonner didn't hesitate. He pushed himself to his feet and joined his team. They were spread out across the battlefield, each soldier doing their part to defend the colony. Bonner's team fought with everything they had, firing at drones, pushing civilians to safety, and ensuring the humans didn't give up their ground. But the pressure was relentless. The drones weren't the only threat. Azerothian ground troops had begun to land. These soldiers, controlled by the AI, were nearly as advanced as the drones, armed with weapons that were beyond anything the humans could ever dream of creating. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, and they were trained for one thing: destruction. The human soldiers knew they had to hold them off, but with each passing second, it felt more and more like the odds were slipping away. Bonner was no stranger to battle. He had fought in many wars, and he had seen his share of horrors. But nothing compared to this. The destruction, the sheer scale of the enemy's power, was something humanity had never faced before. Still, there was no turning back now. Bonner gritted his teeth and continued to fight. He could hear Harper's voice over the comms again. "They're closing in on the northern perimeter. We need backup." Bonner's heart skipped a beat. The northern perimeter was where the most vulnerable people had gathered. The children and elderly were stationed in the shelters there. If the Azerothians breached that line, everything would be lost. Bonner had no choice but to make a desperate move. "Harper, I'm heading to the northern perimeter." "Cover me," he shouted. Without waiting for a response, he ran toward the danger zone. As he sprinted across the battlefield, he saw the Azerothian ground troops advancing toward the shelter. Their weapons were aimed at the civilians, ready to annihilate anyone in their path. Bonner wasn't going to let that happen. He had seen too much. He couldn't allow innocent lives to be destroyed. He reached the northern perimeter, just as the first wave of enemy soldiers began to break through the defenses. Bonner's heart raced as he dove into the fray. The noise was deafening. The crack of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the explosion of grenades, everything seemed to blur together. In the chaos, Bonner saw one of the Azerothian soldiers raise their weapon, aiming at a group of children who were trying to escape. Without thinking, Bonner lunged at the soldier, knocking them to the ground. The soldier's weapon went flying, and Bonner quickly took control. He fired his gun, taking down the soldier, but he knew it wasn't enough. More were coming. "Keep moving. Get to the shelters." Bonner shouted to the civilians, his voice strained but filled with determination. He could see the fear in their eyes, but there was no time to comfort them. The shelter doors had to be secured before the enemy reached them. Just as Bonner thought the worst was over, a massive explosion rocked the northern perimeter. One of the Azerothian drones had managed to break through the defenses and dropped a bomb directly onto the shelter's entrance. The force of the blast sent debris flying in every direction, and Bonner was thrown back against a wall. His ears rang, and his vision blurred for a second time. He forced himself to his feet, fighting through the pain. But when he looked up, his heart sank. The shelter entrance had been destroyed. The civilians were trapped. Bonner's mind raced. They had no choice now but to make their stand, right here, right now. There would be no retreat, no hiding. They had to fight with everything they had, or humanity's last hope would be gone forever. As the sky above Earth burned with explosions and the sound of battle raged on, a new fight began to unfold beneath the surface. The humans of the colony had been pushed to the brink, but the battle wasn't over yet. Hidden beneath the earth, far from the bombs and chaos above, was the underground resistance. This network of secret bunkers, tunnels, and safe havens had been the last refuge for survivors and soldiers alike. Bonner had led the last charge to protect the civilians, but now, with the northern perimeter destroyed and the shelter compromised, he knew the only option left was to retreat into the underground resistance. The humans had spent years building this network in case of a day like this, when the surface was no longer safe, and they would have to fight from the shadows. Bonner stumbled through the rubble toward the entrance of one of the deepest bunkers. His breath was heavy, his body aching from the battle. He'd fought countless battles before, but the sight of the destruction and the loss of so many innocent lives had taken a toll on him. As he neared the bunker's entrance, he could see the heavy metal door was already opening, and his team was ushering the survivors inside. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with tension. Refugees, soldiers, and survivors filled the narrow hallways, their faces pale and filled with fear. Children clung to their parents, and the elderly leaned on walking sticks, But there was one thing they all had in common: determination. Despite the devastation on the surface, the humans weren't giving up. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. That was enough to keep fighting. Bonner's mind raced as he entered the bunker. His team had barely made it in time, but he could see the looks of resolve on their faces. The fight wasn't over yet. The Azerothians had the upper hand, but the humans still had their will to survive, and that would be their greatest weapon. In the bunker's command center, Bonner was met by Lieutenant Bishop, the leader of the underground resistance. Bishop was calm, his face hardened by years of war, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes as he saw Bonner. The two men exchanged a brief nod, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Bishop knew the fight was far from over. "We've lost the surface, Bonner," Bishop said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "But we haven't lost the war. This underground network was built for moments like this. It's our time to strike back." Bonner nodded, but his heart weighed heavy with doubt. How could they fight back? The Azerothians were more powerful than anything the humans had ever faced. The AI-controlled aliens had technology that made humanity's weapons seem like toys. But there was something the aliens didn't have, something that Bonner had witnessed over and over again during the battle: the human spirit. "We'll need more than just a fight to survive," Bonner replied, his voice barely a whisper. "We need a plan. We need a way to turn this around. The Azerothian Eye knows everything about us. They've anticipated every move we've made." Bishop's eyes narrowed as he thought for a moment. "You're right," he said finally. "But that's where we have an advantage. The Azerothians might know our moves, but they don't understand us. They don't understand our will to survive, to fight for our families, our homes. And that's what will make the difference. We can't fight them the same way they fight us. We have to outsmart them." As Bonner listened to Bishop, he began to understand. The underground resistance wasn't just about hiding. It was about regrouping, about finding a new way to fight. The humans had lost the surface, but they hadn't lost their ability to think, to adapt, to survive. They had a fighting chance, and Bonner wasn't about to let that go to waste. The plan, though still in its early stages, began to form. The humans would use their knowledge of the underground network to strike at the Azerothian supply lines. They would hit them where it hurt, in ways the AI couldn't predict. The humans had the advantage of surprise, and they would use it. But the plan wasn't without risks. Every mission they launched would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee that they would succeed. But at least they had a fighting chance. Bonner knew what was at stake. Every human in the bunker depended on him now. He had to lead them. He had to make sure they survived. But most importantly, he had to make sure they never lost hope. If the humans gave up now, everything they had fought for would have been in vain. As the resistance members worked quickly to prepare for their first strike, Bonner took a moment to reflect. The surface had been lost, but it wasn't the end. The fight was just beginning, and there was still so much at stake. The Azerothian Eye had underestimated humanity before, and now they would pay the price. Bonner's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. It was Sergeant Harper, still injured but determined to help. "What's the plan, Captain?" Harper asked, his voice strong despite the pain he was in. Bonner looked at Harper, then back at the room filled with soldiers and refugees. The plan was still in motion, but one thing was clear: this was humanity's last stand. The Azerothians might have destroyed their homes, their cities, and their families, but they had not destroyed their will to fight. And as long as they had that, they would never give up. "We fight back," Bonner said simply. "We fight, and we take back what's ours. We show them what humans are capable of." Harper smiled, despite the pain. "Then let's make them regret ever coming here." And with that, the humans began to prepare for the hardest fight of their lives. They might have been hiding underground, but they weren't hiding in fear. They were preparing to strike back, to hit the Azerothian Eye where it hurt the most. The battle for humanity's survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. The day had begun with chaos, but now it was a full-scale war. The humans had retreated underground to regroup, but it was clear they couldn't hide forever. Bonner's team had received their orders. It was time to take the fight back to the Azerothian forces. The underground resistance had been preparing for this moment for days, gathering weapons, intelligence, and supplies. But now it was all about courage. Every man and woman in the resistance knew the risks. The battle above was intense, and the fight below would be just as brutal. Bonner stood in the command center of the bunker, staring at the holographic map of the colony. The Azerothians were getting closer, and their drones had already breached several of the deeper tunnels. The human forces had to act quickly, or the resistance would be wiped out. The plan was simple but dangerous. A direct strike on one of the Azerothian strongholds hidden beneath the surface. If they could destroy it, they might have a chance to disrupt the enemy's control over their robotic forces. But that meant engaging the enemy up close. The humans would have to fight in confined spaces, face to face with machines that were faster, stronger, and better equipped. It was going to be a slaughter unless they could outsmart the enemy. Bonner knew that the Azerothian soldiers had no emotions, no weaknesses. They were programmed for one thing: efficiency. They didn't hesitate, didn't feel fear, and they certainly didn't show mercy. In close-quarters combat, the humans' only hope was their agility, their quick thinking, and their sheer determination to survive. As the team gathered their gear, Bonner felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. He had led countless missions, but this one felt different. They weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting for survival. If they failed, humanity would be lost forever. "Everyone ready?" Bonner asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. His team nodded. They had faced overwhelming odds before, and they were ready to do it again. They made their way through the narrow tunnels, the dim lights casting long shadows on the walls. Every step felt like it was taking them deeper into the heart of enemy territory. The smell of damp earth and metal filled the air, and the echo of their footsteps was the only sound that broke the silence. They finally reached their target, a heavily fortified Azerothian control center buried deep underground. The walls were lined with thick steel, and the entrance was guarded by a small squad of Azerothian drones. Bonner motioned for his team to spread out, staying in the shadows to avoid detection. The drones were equipped with cloaking devices, but Bonner knew how to spot them. He had trained for this moment, and now he had to trust his instincts. The first drone appeared, its outline faintly shimmering in the air. Bonner fired first, taking it out with a single shot. The drone crumpled to the ground, its cloaking device failing. The rest of the team moved in quickly, taking down the remaining drones one by one. It wasn't easy, but they worked as a unit, their movements coordinated and precise. They didn't have the luxury of time, and every second mattered. Once the drones were neutralized, Bonner and his team approached the control center. The door was reinforced, but the human soldiers had explosives at their disposal. They set the charges and moved back to take cover. Bonner's heart raced as he counted down the seconds. 5 seconds. The countdown was too fast. 4 seconds. His hand gripped his rifle tighter. 3 seconds. He glanced at his team. Their faces hardened with resolve. 2 seconds. He braced for the explosion. 1 second. The explosion rocked the tunnel, sending a shockwave that rattled the bones of every soldier. The door to the control center was blown wide open, revealing a large room filled with Azerothian soldiers and advanced technology. The humans wasted no time. They stormed in, guns blazing, determined to push through the enemy defenses. The battle in the control room was brutal. The Azerothians fought with the precision of machines, but the humans fought with something they didn't have: heart. Bonner moved swiftly, taking out 2 drones with a single burst of fire. But then, one of the Azerothian soldiers lunged at him, slamming him into the wall. Bonner grunted in pain as he struggled to break free. The soldier was faster, its mechanical strength overwhelming. Just as Bonner thought he was done for, Sergeant Harper appeared out of nowhere, tackling the Azerothian soldier to the ground. Harper's actions were quick and decisive. He pulled out a combat knife and drove it into the soldier's throat. The robot's body went limp, and Harper quickly pulled Bonner to his feet. "You good, Captain?" Harper asked, his face covered in sweat and grime. Bonner nodded, wiping the blood from his mouth. "Yeah, let's finish this." The fight was far from over, but the humans were making progress. They pushed forward, clearing the room of Azerothian soldiers and drones. Every step was a battle, and every inch gained felt like a small victory. But Bonner knew it wasn't enough. They still had to destroy the control center's core, or the Azerothians would keep coming. As Bonner and his team reached the central command console, they were met by a fierce resistance. The Azerothian leader, an imposing figure with glowing red eyes and a voice like static, appeared in front of them. "You cannot win, human," it said, its voice cold and mechanical. "You are outmatched. This war is over." Bonner stood his ground, despite the pain in his body. "You may have superior technology, but you will never understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. This is our home, and we will not let you take it." With a roar, the battle continued. But in that moment, Bonner understood that no matter what happened, the humans had already won. They had fought with everything they had. They had fought for their families, for their homes, and for their future. Even if they didn't defeat the Azerothians that day, they had already proven that humanity would never be ruled by machines. As the team finally destroyed the control center, Bonner felt a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. The Azerothian eye had been dealt a blow, but the cost was high. The room was littered with the bodies of both human and Azerothian soldiers, and the air was thick with the scent of burning metal. Bonner knew that this fight was far from over, but one thing was certain: the humans would never stop fighting. The battle for survival had been won, but the war with the air in the bunker was heavy with anticipation. The humans had taken back control of their underground resistance, but the war was far from over. The Azerothian eye still controlled vast portions of the surface, and their drones continued to flood the skies. But Bonner and his team knew one thing: the tide had begun to turn. They had struck a major blow by taking down the control center, but now it was time for the final push. Bonner stood at the front of the command center, staring at the map displayed before him. The Azerothians had several strongholds remaining, but the one that worried him the most was the Azerothian Command Corps, a massive fortress-like structure at the heart of their operations. It was heavily guarded and would take everything they had to breach it. But Bonner had no doubt. The human resistance could pull it off. They had come too far to back down now. Lieutenant Bishop stepped up beside him, his face grim. "The AI's strongholds are well defended," he said, "but we know their weaknesses. This final assault will be our last chance." Just as Bonner thought he was done for, Sergeant Harper appeared out of nowhere, tackling the Azerothian soldier to the ground. Harper's actions were quick and decisive. He pulled out a combat knife and drove it into the soldier's throat. The robot's body went limp, and Harper quickly pulled Bonner to his feet. "You good, Captain?" Harper asked, his face covered in sweat and grime. Bonner nodded, wiping the blood from his mouth. "Yeah, let's finish this." The fight was far from over, but the humans were making progress. They pushed forward, clearing the room of Azerothian soldiers and drones. Every step was a battle, and every inch gained felt like a small victory. But Bonner knew it wasn't enough. They still had to destroy the control center's core, or the Azerothians would keep coming. As Bonner and his team reached the central command console, they were met by a fierce resistance. The Azerothian leader, an imposing figure with glowing red eyes and a voice like static, appeared in front of them. "You cannot win, human," it said, its voice cold and mechanical. "You are outmatched. This war is over." Bonner stood his ground, despite the pain in his body. "You may have superior technology, but you will never understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. This is our home, and we will not let you take it." With a roar, the battle continued. But in that moment, Bonner understood that no matter what happened, the humans had already won. They had fought with everything they had. They had fought for their families, for their homes, and for their future. Even if they didn't defeat the Azerothians that day, they had already proven that humanity would never be ruled by machines. As the team finally destroyed the control center, Bonner felt a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. The Azerothian eye had been dealt a blow, but the cost was high. The room was littered with the bodies of both human and Azerothian soldiers, and the air was thick with the scent of burning metal. Bonner knew that this fight was far from over, but one thing was certain: the humans would never stop fighting. The battle for survival had been won, but the war of the air in the bunker was heavy with anticipation. The humans had taken back control of their underground resistance, but the war was far from over. The Azerothian eye still controlled vast portions of the surface, and their drones continued to flood the skies. But Bonner and his team knew one thing: the tide had begun to turn. They had struck a major blow by taking down the control center, but now it was time for the final push. Bonner stood at the front of the command center, staring at the map displayed before him. The Azerothians had several strongholds remaining, but the one that worried him the most was the Azerothian Command Corps, a massive fortress-like structure at the heart of their operations. It was heavily guarded and would take everything they had to breach it. But Bonner had no doubt. The human resistance could pull it off. They had come too far to back down now. Lieutenant Bishop stepped up beside him, his face grim. "The AI's strongholds are well defended," he said, "but we know their weaknesses. This final assault will be our last chance." Bonner nodded, his mind racing. They had come so close, but the stakes had never been higher. This battle would decide everything. If they failed, humanity would fall under the oppressive rule of the Azerothian eye. There was no turning back now. "We've lost too many people already," Bonner said, his voice low but filled with determination. "But we've got something they don't. We've got heart. We've got something to fight for. Let's make sure this ends today." The rest of the team gathered around, each soldier ready for whatever came next. There were no illusions left. This mission was a one-way trip. They would either succeed and reclaim Earth, or they would die fighting for the future of humanity. The final push began early the next morning. The humans emerged from their underground bunker, armed and ready. Their goal was simple: get to the Azerothian Command Corps, destroy it, and sever the AI's control over the rest of their forces. It was a dangerous mission, and Bonner knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. As the team moved forward, Bonner couldn't help but notice the landscape above had changed. The surface of the Earth was unrecognizable, scared by explosions, the atmosphere thick with smoke. The once vibrant cities were now burning husks, remnants of a world that had been shattered. But despite the destruction, there was something that hadn't been destroyed: the humans' will to fight. Their journey was difficult. The team had to fight through Azerothian patrols and dodge enemy drones. They made their way across a desolate city, their every step shadowed by the mechanical drones overhead. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the battle that raged around them. Bonner knew they had to move quickly. They couldn't afford to waste time. The longer they waited, the stronger the Azerothians would become. They approached the Azerothian Command Corps under the cover of darkness, using the crumbling buildings for cover. Bonner's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the final moment. There was no room for mistakes. The entrance to the Command Corps was heavily guarded, with automated defense systems and drones on high alert. But the humans were prepared. They had studied the enemy's movements, learned their patterns, and now it was time to strike. Bonner signaled for the team to split up. They would approach from different directions to confuse the Azerothians and create chaos within their ranks. It was a risky move, but it was the only way they would stand a chance. The first part of the plan went off without a hitch. Bonner's team silently eliminated the first few Azerothian patrols, using the cover of darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. But as they neared the entrance to the command core, they encountered a new threat, an Azerothian battle robot. Towering over them, its glowing red eyes scanning the area. The humans didn't hesitate. They opened fire, their weapons pinging off the robot's thick armor. But the robot was relentless, its massive metal fists smashing into the ground with terrifying force. The humans fought back, trying to hit the weak spots in its armor, but it seemed invulnerable. Bonner knew they couldn't defeat the robot with brute force. They had to outsmart it. "Harper," Bonner shouted. "Flank it from the right." Sergeant Harper nodded. His eyes narrowed in focus. He darted from cover, his rifle raised, and fired a burst of shots at the robot's exposed side. The shots hit their mark, and the robot stumbled, momentarily losing its footing. Bonner seized the opportunity. He aimed his rifle at the robot's core and fired, hitting the weak spot just beneath its armor. The robot let out a high-pitched screech as it collapsed, sparking and smoking. The humans had won this round, but they knew it was only a matter of time before more enemies arrived. They quickly made their way inside the Azerothian command core, pushing through the final line of defense. The walls were lined with advanced technology, the hum of machinery filling the air. Bonner could feel the tension rise with every step. The Azerothians knew they were coming, and they would not let the humans reach the core without a fight. The final showdown took place in the heart of the command core. The team faced off against an overwhelming number of Azerothian soldiers and robots. The room was filled with the sound of gunfire, the clanging of metal, and the screams of combat. But Bonner and his team fought with everything they had. In the middle of the chaos, Bonner noticed something, a control panel in the center of the room. He knew that if they could destroy it, the Azerothian eye would lose control over their forces. He charged toward the panel, dodging enemy fire. Just as he reached it, a blast from an Azerothian soldier hit his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. His vision blurred, but he pushed through the pain. This was it. With one final effort, Bonner activated the explosive charges attached to the control panel. The explosion sent a shockwave through the room, knocking everyone off their feet. The lights flickered, and the Azerothian forces began to shut down. The battle was over. But Bonner didn't have time to celebrate. His team had suffered heavy losses. Harper, who had fought by his side since the beginning, was gravely injured. Bonner knelt beside him, trying to stop the bleeding. "You're going to make it," he whispered, but deep down, he knew it wasn't true. Harper looked up at him, a faint smile on his face. "We did it, Captain. We won." As Harper's life slipped away, Bonner realized that the fight was not just for survival, it was for the future of humanity. They had won, but at a great cost. And as the last of the Azerothian IA forces fell, Bonner promised that humanity would never forget the sacrifice of those who fought and died for Earth. The war was over. Humanity had won, but the cost was more than anyone could bear. The sound of silence was almost unbearable. The war, which had raged for what felt like years, was finally over. The world around Bonner and the remaining soldiers was still. The Azerothian eye had been defeated, their machines lying broken and silent in the rubble. But despite the quiet, there was a feeling of victory, of triumph. But it came at a heavy cost. Bonner gazed out over the battlefield, his heart heavy with the loss of so many good men and women who had fought by his side. His body ached from the countless injuries he had suffered, but he knew this moment was something they would never forget. Humanity had won. The sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow on the battlefield. The remnants of the Azerothian AI lay scattered in the debris, their once imposing presence now reduced to smoldering wreckage. The humans had taken back what was theirs, but the war had left scars that would never fully heal. Bonner couldn't help but think of his fallen comrades, their faces etched in his mind as he stood there, trying to take in the magnitude of what had just happened. It had been a long road to this moment, and the cost had been staggering. For every victory, there had been a sacrifice, a price that had been paid in blood. The battle had not only been won for survival, but for the future of humanity itself. Against overwhelming odds, they had stood their ground, fought with everything they had, and in the end, they had emerged victorious. But victory felt bittersweet. Bonner took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the remaining survivors of his team. There weren't many left. The group that had begun this mission together had been whittled down to just a handful, but they had succeeded, and that was what mattered most now. The Azerothian Eye was no longer a threat. Humanity had proven that even against the most advanced technology, they could stand tall. They could fight and win. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Lieutenant Bishop, who had come to stand beside him. "We did it, Captain," Bishop said, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Bonner nodded, but the words didn't come easily. There were too many emotions swirling in his chest, and he knew he couldn't let them overwhelm him. He had to be strong, for the fallen, and for those who had survived. As they stood there, reflecting on the battle they had just fought, the rest of the survivors began to gather. There were no words exchanged at first, only quiet nods and somber glances. It was as if they were all trying to process the enormity of what they had accomplished. But then, slowly, one by one, they began to speak. "We did it," Sergeant Harper said, his voice hoarse. He had survived the final battle, though his injuries were severe. "We've won. We've taken Earth back." The others murmured in agreement, each one feeling the weight of the victory, but also the weight of the loss. There was no denying it. Humanity had emerged victorious, but it had been a hard-won battle. Bonner turned to his team, his face serious. "We've lost so much, but we've gained something that can never be taken from us. Our freedom." Freedom. It was a word that had meant little when they were under the rule of the Azerothian Eye, but now it felt like the most precious thing in the world. They had fought for it with everything they had, and now it was theirs once again. "We'll rebuild," Bonner continued, his voice steady. "It will take time, but we'll rebuild. Earth will rise again." As the survivors gathered together, Bonner knew that this was just the beginning. They had reclaimed their world, but the road ahead would be long and difficult. The destruction of the Azerothian Eye was only the first step. Now they would have to rebuild not just the cities and the infrastructure, but the spirit of humanity itself. They would need to find a way to heal the wounds left by the war, to rebuild trust, and to ensure that something like this never happened again. But for now, they could take a moment to breathe. They had done the impossible. They had beaten the Azerothian Eye, and in doing so, they had proven that humanity was not easily defeated. As Bonner looked out at the group, he saw something that filled him with pride. There was a fire in their eyes. It was the same fire that had driven them to fight for their lives, their families, and their future. They had faced down an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered and had won. It was a victory born not just from technology, but from the human spirit, from the will to fight for what was right, from the courage to stand up, even when it seemed impossible. And that was something the Azerothians had never understood, what it meant to be human. With the threat of the Azerothian Eye now gone, there was no more reason to fight. The humans could finally start to rebuild their shattered world. The scars of war would remain, but they would heal. And in time, humanity would rise again. Bonner watched as the survivors began to move, their steps slow but determined. They had won, but they knew the real work had just begun. Together, they would rebuild Earth, and together, they would make sure that the darkness of the war would never return. Bonner stood at the forefront, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity had proven that they could survive, and they could thrive. They had won against an overwhelming enemy, not with superior technology, but with their heart, their courage, and their will to fight for their future. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm light on the survivors, Bonner finally allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle was over. The war was over, and humanity had triumphed. In the end, it wasn't just the Azerothian eye that had fallen. It was the idea that humanity was weak, that they couldn't stand against the might of superior technology. Humanity had shown the galaxy that they were stronger than any machine. The world would heal. Earth would rise again. And humanity's story would continue, stronger than ever.